I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santa Maria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Mormon theology, nearing the end of 1843, continued to expand. Now that the polygamy revelation was written on actual paper, the practice carried with it an air of divinity. Others could now partake and join the anointed quorum in their various clandestine prayer meetings. Before more couples could get their calling and election made sure in Nauvoo, the polygamy revelation, the actual text of it, required presentation to the High Council for their approval. The man to present the polygamy revelation to the High Council, of course, was Hiram Sidekick Smith, Joe's older brother and patriarch of the church. Contrary to what apologists or believing members may think, polygamy was practiced long before modern-day Doctrine and Covenants section 132 was ever actually committed to paper. There had been allusions to polygamy, some kind of polygamy revelation, as early as 1831, just a year after the church started, but there's absolutely no evidence that it was ever written before July of 1843. Regardless of that, people beyond just Joe had been engaged in plural marriages, or spiritual wifery, as the rumors said, for years by the time 1843 rolled around. People were initiated into the practice by degree, dependent upon how well they could be trusted. As a quick refresher, according to Bloody Brigham Young, he was aware of polygamy before even Joe's older brother Hiram was. According to Brigham Young, he was the guy who taught the doctrine of celestial marriage to Hiram Smith. Now, this is from Bloody Brigham's own account, which he preached this in Salt Lake City on October the 8th, 1866. He starts with a bit of rhetoric and propaganda just to solidify his own claims of rightful leadership by providing a brief character sketch of Hiram Sidekick Smith. Then he goes on to tell how he taught Hiram about the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. From his own sermon, October 8th, 1866, quote, "Now Hiram was as good a man as ever lived, and he was no better a man than his brother Joseph. His integrity was of the highest order, but his ability was not equal to Joseph's. Hiram was a positive man. Joseph was a comparative man, regarding everything according to the circumstances of the case, and every person according to the intrinsic worth. Hiram did not know enough to do this. I used to think, and think now, that an angel dwelling in the presence of the Father and the Son possessed no more integrity in their hearts than did Hiram Smith. While he lived, he was Joseph's fast friend. Notwithstanding this, I have heard Joseph tell him that if the church was left to his leadership, he would lead it directly to hell. He never appointed his brother Hiram to be his successor. He never even thought of such a thing, and if my word is good for anything, I can truly say that Joseph told me not 3 months before he was killed, and I did not seek the information he gave me. We were talking upon counseling, governing, and controlling, that if I am moved out of the way, you are the only man living on this earth who can counsel and direct the affairs of the kingdom of God on earth. He often said to me, when speaking upon polygamy, I should die for it, and I would as lieve die for it as not. It is the work of God that he has revealed this principle, and it is not my business to control or dictate it, to say it shall or shall not be. The year was 1842. There were some rails laid along to fence up some of the lots. Hiram saw me and said, Brother Brigham, I want to talk to you. We went together and sat upon the rails that were piled up. He commenced by saying, I have a question for you. In the first place, I say unto you that I do know that you and the 12 know some things that I do not know. I can understand this by the motions and talk and doings of Joseph, and I know there is something or other which I do not understand that is revealed to the 12. Is this so? I replied, I do not know anything about what you know, but I know what I know. Then he said, I've mistrusted for a long time that Joseph had received a revelation that a man should have more than one wife, and he has hinted as much to me, but I would not bear it. We had heard him say such hard things. I recollect in one council where Joseph undertook to teach the brethren and sisters, William Law was there, and William and Hiram and a few others were against Joseph. William Law made this expression, If an angel from heaven was to reveal to me that a man should have more than one wife, and if it were in my power, I would kill him. That was pretty hard, but Joseph had to submit for it. The brethren were not prepared to receive the doctrine. Hiram said to me, I am convinced that there is something that has not been told me. I said to him, Brother Hiram, Joseph would tell you everything the Lord reveals to him if he could. I must confess, I felt a little sarcastic against Hiram, although he was just as honest as an angel and as full of integrity as the gods, but he had not the ability which Joseph possessed to see and understand men as they were. I took full advantage of this, and I said to him, Brother Hiram, I will tell you about this thing which you do not know, if you will swear with an uplifted hand before God that you will never say another word against Joseph and his doings, and the doctrines he is preaching to the people. He replied, I will do it with all my heart. And he stood upon his feet, saying, I want to know the truth and to be saved. And he made a covenant there, never again to bring forward one argument or use any influence against Joseph's doings. Joseph had many wives sealed to him. I told Hiram the whole story, and he bowed to it and wept like a child and said, God be praised. He went to Joseph and told him what he had learned and renewed his covenant with Joseph. And they went heart and hand together while they lived, and they were together when they died, and they are together now defending Israel. End quote. So this story has a few issues, most notably that it was from Brigham Young, bloody Brigham Young himself, more than 20 years after the supposed occurrence, while he was constantly asserting his dominance as the correct prophet, the president of the church. And also, Joseph III was half a decade into his ministry in the reorganization of the church and was pulling away some of the least loyal members of the Utah church to join the reorganization. Also, when it comes to anything concerning the practice of polygamy, it's really hard to take Bloody Brigham's word for it because he was a profoundly dishonest and self-serving guy. Also, there's absolutely no outside corroboration of this interaction. So that's how you qualify Bloody Brigham's account, right? But regardless of how Hiram learned about the celestial polygamous marriage, he became an eager apologist for the doctrine, beginning in early 1843. It was at Hiram's request that Joe finally dictated the revelation that came to be Doctrine and Covenants section 132 to Joe's scribe, William Clayton. A few copies were made in the following days, and the original copy of D&C 132 was burned up at the demand of Emma. Emma was apparently so repulsed by the text of the revelation, for understandable reasons. We've talked about it quite extensively, including the Law of Sarah. She was apparently so repulsed that she wouldn't even touch the revelation with fire tongs to put it in the fire. So Joe put it in the fire for her to express solidarity, but only for a fleeting moment. Once Emma gave her tacit approval of polygamy, that was the dead canary Joe used as the litmus test to teach the doctrine more widely. If she would accept it, then other members of the church would accept it. So 2 days of meetings with the High Council brought all sorts of interesting events. On the 12th of August, 1843, the High Council began their meeting with a brief discourse by Joseph. Then Joe handed the meeting to his brother Hiram, who produced a precious piece of paper from his pocket. This is the council meeting minutes. Quote, the revelation on celestial marriage and plurality of wives is read to the Nauvoo Stake High Council by Hiram Smith. End quote. That's it. That's all the council minutes say. But this was a divisive meeting. So here's a reading of what happened from Newell and Avery's biography of Emma, Mormon Enigma. This is on page 158. Quote, William Marks, president of the Nauvoo Stake, his 2 counselors, Charles C. Rich and Austin Cowles, and 12 or 13 other men were present. During the meeting, Dunbar Wilson asked about the extent and practice of a plurality of wives. He believed the rumors about it had some substance. Hiram Smith walked across the street to his house and returned with a copy of the revelation Joseph had dictated a month earlier. He read it to the High Council. William Marks later said he, quote, felt that it was not true, but he saw the High Council received it, end quote. Hiram's statement that those who believed and obeyed would be saved and those who did not would be damned divided the council. 3 men rejected it out of hand. They were William Marks, Leonard Sobey, and Austin Cowles, who may not have known that his daughter Elvira Cowles had married Joseph on June 1st. William Marks would later struggle between rejecting the revelation and maintaining his loyalty to Joseph. End quote. Now there was no confusion existing among the members of the High Council about whether or not spiritual wifery rumors had any factual basis. It was out in the open. There was no getting the cat back in the bag now. After a few hours of instruction and deliberation, in light of this new revelation, the High Council disbanded for the evening, and they went to their homes to ponder this new revelation. They'd heard the message. Now they were forced to accept it or be damned. The events of the next day are revealing when recounted through the eyes of Wilford Woodruff in his Nauvoo journal. We'll read a few passages and discuss each point and why it's significant. Quote, 13th August. In the morning, Elder Grant and myself walked to the Navy Yard, and I preached and was followed by Elder Grant. In the afternoon, we met with the saints, and Elder Orson Pratt preached upon the subject of Zion from the Psalms of David, and in the evening, Elders Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and myself occupied the time. I addressed the people first and told my experience, and felt much of the Spirit of God in bearing testimony that Joseph Smith Sr. was a prophet of God, that the Book of Mormon was true, and that the work we were engaged in was of God. I followed Elders Kimball and Young, who also bore testimony of the work of God by the power of God. End quote. So the men named here are Wilford Woodruff's fellow warriors in building the kingdom of Zion. With the new license they had to preach polygamy to select individuals, of course, a renewed zeal invigorated their preaching. Now they could have multiple wives, and they had a revelation from the one true prophet of God commanding them to take multiple wives and to do so or be damned. Now all they needed to do was carefully choose who would learn of the mysteries and how to convince the recipients that it was indeed true and of God. The next few passages from Willie Goat Woodruff's journal require a bit of discussion. Quote, Sidney Rigdon disfellowshipped by church conference 13th August 1843. We have had certain traders in this city who have been writing falsehoods to Missouri. There's a certain man in this city who has made a covenant to betray and give me up, that too before the Governor Carlin commenced his persecution. This testimony I have from gentlemen from abroad, and I do not wish to give their names. Sidney Rigdon, I most solemnly proclaim the withdrawal of my fellowship from this man, on the condition that the judging be true, and let the saints proclaim it abroad that he may no longer be acknowledged as my counselor, and that all who feel to sanction my proceedings and views will manifest it by uplifted hands. It was unanimous vote that Sidney Rigdon be disfellowshipped and his license demanded. End quote. Yes, Hingepin Sidney Rigdon was disfellowshipped from the church. Now, this is notable because Rigdon was one of the main OG Mormons since his conversion in 1830, the same year the Book of Mormon was published, and him converting about 200 of his followers to the church the very next year. Truly, in many ways, it's because of Sidney Rigdon that Mormonism became what it is today. He's been a central figure of our timeline since episode 14 when he made his introduction into our historical timeline. For some illumination on this disfellowshipping, I'm going to turn to Richard Van Wagner's ultimate biography of Sidney Rigdon, titled A Portrait of Religious Excess, beginning on page 311. Quote, After the dust had settled over Joseph Smith's overtures to Nancy Rigdon, Smith was uncomfortable around the Rigdon family, viewing them with a keen sense of paranoia. And of course, for more information on Joseph's proposal to Sidney Rigdon's eldest single daughter, Nancy Rigdon, search in the backlogs for episode Miss Nancy. That's the episode you want to find. Smith was uncomfortable around the Rigdon family, viewing them with a keen sense of paranoia. Smith's imposing presence usually overshadowed disaffection, and the Rigdons' refusal to subordinate their interests to his angered him. He felt that his prophetic domain was compromised. Although the 1842-44 Smith-Rigdon relationship was not as acrimonious as depicted in official accounts, their mutual accommodation was an uneasy one. The unspoken truce was frequently disrupted by Smith's groundless charges that Rigdon, in league with John C. Bennett, was behind legal efforts to extradite Smith to Missouri. This apprehension was particularly evident in the matters related to the Nauvoo post office. End quote. So this wasn't the totality of the conflict that led to Hingepin Rigdon's, disfellowshipping. We'll see temporary momentarily here. But to complicate matters further was that the whole post office affair, right? Joe had repeatedly accused Sidney Rigdon of withholding his mail or giving his mail to spies and enemies within the church. And once again, these accusations have no basis in provable facts beyond just repeated accusations. Notably, Rigdon and Emma had actually gone back and forth on this issue since the latter half of 1842 when the accusations first cropped up, and the issue still wasn't resolved by the end of 1843. So regardless of whether or not Rigdon was stealing or screening Joe's mail, a hidden ulterior motive existed in the mind of Joe when he made these various attempts to get Rigdon fired from the post office and disfellowshipped from the church. For that, we continue in Van Wagner's excellent biography of Sidney Rigdon. Quote, From the earliest Nauvoo settlement years, Smith was envious that George W. Robinson, that's Sidney Rigdon's son-in-law, then Sidney Rigdon, held the financially lucrative position of postmaster. In the midst of the Bennett controversy, Smith initiated a campaign to attain the postmastership for himself. He may have also wanted to monitor mail from such apostates as John C. Bennett, Francis Higbee, and George W. Robinson. Because postal matters and the Rigdon family were outside of his control, Smith attempted to slander the Rigdons by asserting that the mails were regularly plundered and mishandled. End quote. So Joe and Rigdon's relationship was in tatters from their conflicts about polygamy, and then Joe propositioning Rigdon's eldest single daughter, Nancy, in 1842, and of course, Joe's suspicion that Rigdon was colluding with Bennett in order to get Joe arrested and then extradited to Missouri, which nearly came to fruition earlier in this year. It was only a few months prior to this disfellowshipping when Joe was arrested in Dixon, Illinois, and the Danites were called out to rescue him from Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds. The conflict between Joe and Rigdon had to be resolved. So let's chase this rabbit trail. At this time in 1843, they had had 13 years together as co-presidents of the church. Now, they had some serious issues during that time, but they've largely stuck together through thick and thin. However, Rigdon's presence in Nauvoo had waned since his time was more occupied with his duties as postmaster and with general intemperance in the privacy of his home. But the issues between Joe and Rigdon by late 1843 seem irresolvable. However, in a few months' time from this late 1843, Joe is running for president of the United States with Sidney Rigdon as his vice presidential candidate. How does this conflict get resolved? And how does Rigdon run as Joe's right-hand man while being disfellowshipped from the church? Well, less than a month after he was disfellowshipped, Rigdon appealed his case to the High Council. So they convened in the first week of October 1843 to finally bury the hatchet on this issue. Now, this hearing has been extremely whitewashed in the historical record, both by the original minute takers of the meeting and by the compilers of church history since then, in an effort to paint Rigdon as the villain and to minimize his position in the church because Bloody Brigham Young, of course, was the right guy to take the mantle. It wasn't Rigdon. So bear that in mind as I read a few extracts from the History of the Church. This is the Dan Vogel edition, Volume 6, where this special conference was called to hear Rigdon's case in hope that he would retain his membership and not be, and the disfellowshipping would not stand. So here we go. Quote, President Joseph Smith stated the items of business to be brought before the conference to be the case and standing of Elder Sidney Rigdon, counselor to the First Presidency. Elder Sidney Rigdon addressed to the conference on the subject of his situation and circumstances among the saints. End quote. That's it. So this is a crucial moment for Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, right? So he'd been a pastor for nearly 2 decades by this point, right? He'd cultivated an incredible power of oratory in that 2 decades of practice. However, as his mental health had significantly weakened since his stint in Liberty Jail in 1838 to 39, and of course with the following chaos of settling Nauvoo and many of his friends dying from sickness, he had a habit of running on and on through meaningless tangents and ethereal tirades into the mysteries that plagued his mind. What would that be like, right, people? So the defense that Rigdon provided for himself and retaining his membership has been so deeply propagandized that it's hard to even ascertain the nuggets of truth at the center of what's recorded in the history of the church. That one line that I just read, Elder Sidney Rigdon addressed the conference on the subject of his situation and circumstances among the saints. That is the extent of his opening argument in his own defense. That is the entire thing. But we know that Rigdon, of course, he probably spoke for an hour or 2 hours making his case, right? But of course, that's all that was recorded. So next to testify in the council, arguing that Rigdon should remain disfellowshipped, was the prosecuting party, Joseph Smith himself. Quote, President Joseph Smith addressed the conference, inviting an expression of any charges or complaints which the conference had to make. He stated his dissatisfaction with Elder Sidney Rigdon as a counselor, not having received any material benefit from his labors of counsel since their escape from Missouri. What would you say you actually do around here, Rigdon? Several complaints were then brought forward in reference to his management in the post office, a supposed correspondence in connection with John C. Reckitt Bennett, with ex-Governor Carlin, and with the Missourians of a treacherous character. Also, his leaguing with dishonest persons in endeavoring to defraud the innocent. End quote. So no further details are actually offered on the exact accusations, the supposed correspondence between, Rigdon and Joe's primary enemies, or even concerning Rigdon's endeavoring to defraud the innocent. There's just no further details on this. And the surviving record is deliberately light on the process of this hearing. So let's try to read between the lines, though, and see what we can try and extract, right? We need to understand that in many ways, Joe was embarrassed in the presence of Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. Look, Rigdon picked Joe up from the depths of treasure-digging infamy during Joe's early career as the Mormon prophet, right? Rigdon had facilitated everything that Joe enjoyed in Nauvoo as a result of converting to Joe's church and becoming co-president with Joe in 1830. Beyond that, the Rigdons and Smiths had been friends for more than a decade by this point, right? Joe had watched Sidney and Phoebe's family grow up, their children mature into adulthood, had them over and had been over to their home for countless meals and meetings and whatnot. Emma and Phoebe were rather close as well. Joe had watched all of their kids grow up, and both Emma and Phoebe were frequently pregnant and having kids at the same time, right? Joe had also watched young Nancy grow up into the beautiful and smart young woman that she was in Nauvoo since the age of 11 years old, and then had asked her to become one of his dozens of wives. I personally believe that Joe was ashamed of his actions because he knew it wasn't right. He had betrayed the trust of one of his dearest friends. Refusing to admit to wrongdoing for propositioning Rigdon's teenage daughter would come with all sorts of consequences that Joe obviously didn't want to deal with. So Joe instead decided to turn Hingepin Rigdon into his enemy by fabricating charges and solidifying the persecution narrative against the one true prophet of God. However, there is no evidence, aside from Joe's accusations, that Rigdon was ever actually disloyal to Joseph Smith. Rigdon had sacrificed a lot for Joe and the advancement of Joe's career. Joe thanked him by trying to sleep with his teenage daughter and cut him out of the church leadership through disfellowshipping. Rigdon saw a different Joseph Smith than every other person in the church, right? Rigdon was uniquely poised in church leadership and knew most of what transpired behind closed doors. Events he didn't have explicit knowledge of. He would hear the rumors of these events, and then he could make an accurate judgment call and decide how true they were, right? That's why he immediately sided with his daughter when she told him about Joe's advances. Rigdon had been dealing with the consequences of Joe's sexual indiscretions for over a decade. He knew what really happened between his daughter and the prophet, right? So in my opinion, I think that Joseph Smith was just embarrassed to be in Rigdon's presence, in the entire Rigdon family's presence, because he knew that he had done wrong by one of his earliest and closest and most devoted friends. The next passage in the documentary history of the church is quite interesting, and it does seem a bit contradictory. You'll see what I mean when I read it. Quote, President Joseph Smith related to the conference the detention of documents from Justin Butterfield, Esquire, which was designed for the benefit of himself, but were not handed over for some 3 or 4 weeks, greatly to his disadvantage. Also, an indirect testimony from Missouri through the mother of Orrin P. Rockwell, that's Pistol Pack and Porter, said Rigdon and others had given information by letter of President Smith's visit to Dixon, advising them to proceed to that place and arrest him there. He stated that in consequences of those and other circumstances, and his unprofitableness to him as a counselor, Joseph did not wish to retain Rigdon in that situation, unless those difficulties could be removed, but desired his salvation and expressed his willingness that he should retain a place among the saints. End quote. These were Joe's arguments that he was making against retaining Hingepin Rigdon as a counselor and a member of the church elite, right? The document that he designated to Justin Butterfield that apparently wasn't delivered for 3 or 4 weeks after it was supposed to be, that was one of the main accusations that he was mad about. It was probably related to the Sarah and Maria Lawrence estate that Joseph and Emma had taken on as custodians of, that $8,000, right? So that was one of the primary accusations Joe made, that this document wasn't delivered for 3 or 4 weeks after it was supposed to be. And also hearsay from Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell's mom that she had claimed Rigdon shared Joe's Dixon location with the Missouri government, which led to Joe's arrest that previous June. Now, the letter isn't produced. It's just hearsay. Joe just claims that it exists in the historical record here. Now, this was important for Joe to get to the bottom of, right? Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds showed up in Dixon completely unexpectedly when they arrested Joseph. He was caught completely off guard. The fact that these sheriffs knew right where to find Joe and were even in the right town on the right day was a serious cause for suspicion among the Mormon elite. Only a few people knew Joe would be in Dixon. So who leaked it? Who among the High Council could no longer be trusted? The boat wasn't watertight. Joe personally concluded it was probably Rigdon, and these accusations in this entire hearing of disfellowshipping Sidney Rigdon is the result of this. Also, Joe claimed that Rigdon isn't really pulling his weight around here, and I'm sick of carrying around this deadbeat. Then Joe said that these are the problems with Sidney Rigdon. If they can be explained away, then he can remain here, implying that he didn't want Rigdon to remain in the presidency of the church, but he could remain on the membership records with sufficient excuses to dismiss these accusations of treason against the prophet. Rigdon was allowed to respond, and this is how his response is recorded in the history of the church. Once again, this is the propagandized version of the events. This is a result of multiple people propagandizing and whitewashing Mormon history in order to make Brigham Young sound like the ultimate guy and to diminish Sidney Rigdon's role in the historical record. So what actually happened in this council has just been lost to history. Only a few scant records shed any more light on this situation. But this is from the history of the church. Quote, Elder Sidney Rigdon pled concerning the document from Justin Butterfield, Esquire, that he received it in answer to some inquiries which he had transmitted to him, that he received it at a time when he was sick and unable to examine it, did not know that it was designed for the perusal and benefit of President Joseph Smith, that he had consequently ordered it to be laid aside where it remained until inquired for by Joseph Smith. He had never written to Missouri concerning the visit of Joseph Smith to Dixon and knew of no other person having done so. That concerning certain rumors of belligerent operations under Governor Carlin's administration, he had related to them not to alarm or disturb anyone, but that he had rumors from good authorities and supposed them well-founded. That he had never received but one communication from John C. Bennett, and that of a business character, except one addressed to him conjointly with Elder Orson Pratt, which he handed over to President Smith, that he had never written any letters to John C. Bennett. End quote. So let's tease that apart. Okay, so with the Justin Butterfield document, Rigdon said, I was sick when it came into the post office, and I didn't know that it was so important to you, so I just held it at the post office until you called for it. Okay, so that's a good excuse. As to telling Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds that Joe would be in Dixon so that they could arrest him, Rigdon simply flatly denied it and said, I don't know who did it, but it wasn't me. The same with the accusation about working with Governor Carlin to get Joe arrested at the end of 1842. Just flat denied it. I didn't have anything to do with it. Now, the thing is, nobody knows how Sheriffs Wilson and Reynolds knew that Joe would be in Dixon. But it may have been another of the Nauvoo leadership that Joe didn't expect at the time. Now, personally, I'd be much quicker to finger William Law or one of the Higbees for that little intel breach, but that's just me, in my opinion. Joe wasn't exactly wanting for enemies within leadership ranks of the church. There were plenty of enemies to go around, and his hold on leadership wasn't as tenacious as any despotic regime leader might require. So, as for the letter that Joe had with him from Reckitt Bennett that was written to Orson Pratt and Sidney Rigdon, Rigdon simply said that that was the only letter he'd ever received from Bennett, and that he never had written a letter to Bennett aside from regular business stuff. Now, the thing is about this, because, we only have the historical record only reveals this one letter that we know about. There may have been other letters. We simply don't know. We do know that Rigdon had flatly denied true things in the past. So it's a matter of whether or not the High Council decided to take Joe's side in the debate and believe these accusations, or take Rigdon's side and believe his denials and rationalizations. So, holding in suspense, the meeting adjourned for the evening. Rigdon's membership held in the balance, and they decided, it's a good time for lunch break, right? The hearing resumed on the next day, and Rigdon began the day with making his case, and a bit of a recap. Quote, Elder Sidney Rigdon resumed his plea of defense. He related the circumstances of his reception in the city of Quincy after his escape from Missouri, the cause of his delay in not going to the city of Washington on an express to which he had been appointed, and closed with a moving appeal to President Joseph Smith concerning their former friendship, associations, and sufferings, and expressed his willingness to resign his place, though with sorrowful and indescribable feelings. During this address, the sympathies of the congregation were highly excited." End quote. Hingepin Sidney Rigdon, true to his natural form, delivered a deeply emotive speech, relating the persecutions that he and the Mormons had suffered, his time in jail, and everything that he and Joe had been through together. "You can't do me like this, Joe." And as usual, when Rigdon spoke, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Sure, Rigdon could be a blowhard, but when it came down to brass tacks like this, the dude still had it in him, right? The rest of the meeting included Almon W. Babbitt, Hiram Smith, and William Law, all testifying in Rigdon's behalf. So after they testified for Rigdon, Joe made up a final statement. Quote, "President Joseph Smith arose and satisfactorily explained to the congregation the supposed treacherous correspondence with ex-Governor Garland, which wholly removed suspicion from Elder Sidney Rigdon and from every other person, and he expressed entire willingness to have Elder Sidney Rigdon retain his station, provided he would magnify his office and walk and conduct himself in all honesty, righteousness, and integrity, but signified his lack of confidence in Rigdon's integrity and steadfastness, judging from their past intercourse." End quote. So, the final speech of the day, Joe came clean, saying that he didn't actually have any evidence that Rigdon had committed treason against the prophet and the church, and he was willing to have Rigdon continue as his personal counselor, but he was also a bit apprehensive. So this is actually kind of understandable, right? If we just look at this a little bit more in the meta and kind of an overarching perspective, Joe could control just about everybody in that room. Nearly everybody in the High Council was under his spell, or so he thought anyway. Rigdon, however, wasn't so captivated by the prophet and therefore couldn't be controlled by Joe. Every minute Joe remained with Rigdon as his personal counselor was another minute that he didn't have control over every aspect of his life, right? Rigdon was basically one of the only people in Joe's closest group who wasn't a yes man to the prophet. Every public figure like Joe needs to have a devil's advocate, but Joe didn't realize how beneficial it was to him and the entire religion to keep Rigdon close and on church payroll. However, most powerful men like John don't see the utility in a devil's advocate and ignore or squash or silence or delete any negative or critical voices in their own little circle. But there's another angle to consider here, right? That of the other leaders who weren't fully captivated, kind of like Rigdon wasn't, right? Maybe some of the other elites who weren't in like the death cult camp type of mindset, like, Bloody Brigham was, of course. Maybe they saw Rigdon as an asset to the leadership, right? Rigdon could be the faithful contrarian that Joe needed at his left hand to keep Joe's power and ego in check, but also to, in some ways, suffer the wrath of the prophet because Rigdon was strong enough to handle it, right? Consider it from like William Law's perspective, right? If you're an elite who is scared of the prophet, you'll probably do everything in your power to keep Rigdon around, the one guy around who can keep Joe from going completely off the deep end. And William Law is not the only one. An example of somebody who fits this bill would be William Marks. William Marks notably was a pragmatist and opposed to polygamy and aggressive Mormon expansionism. However, Marks was president of the Nauvoo stake, which poised him much lower in the pecking order than Sidney Rigdon. Marks and Rigdon were close friends, and they were more similar in like personal theologies than either of them were to Joe's theology. So if Rigdon was cut from the leadership ranks, Marks would have one less ally in Nauvoo leadership, which could be life-threatening, okay? Now, I'd be willing to bet there were other guys in this high council who were equally terrified at Mormon expansionism, but to speak out against that could lead to taking a water nap in the Mississippi. If you're one of those guys like William Marks or even William Law, you want Rigdon to stick around as long as possible. So with that in mind, the council concluded their meeting by calling a vote. Quote, on motion by William Marks and seconded by Patriarch Hiram Smith, conference voted that Elder Sidney Rigdon be permitted to retain his station as counselor to the first president. End quote. And it was official. Rigdon would not only remain in fellowship with the church, but he retained his role as a personal counselor to Joe. Joe's reaction is very revealing. Quote, President Joseph Smith arose and said, I have thrown him off my shoulders, and you have again put him on me. You may carry him, but I will not. End quote. Try as he might, Joe couldn't get Rigdon removed. The one dissenter who was faithful, the one person who wouldn't say yes, sir, to everything. Joe couldn't get Rigdon removed with the approval of other members of the Nauvoo leadership. Whatever transpired after this, away from the blurry vision of the historical record, Joe and Rigdon's relationship would improve from this time forward as a result of it. Rigdon was the monkey Joe couldn't get off his back, but keeping Rigdon close within the leadership ranks was in everybody's best interest. What do I mean by that? Well, consider Rigdon's history with Joe and the religion, as well as his current place. He knew enough to be truly dangerous should he turn bitter dissenter after being officially excommunicated. That's a detail that isn't illuminated by anything available in the historical record. But what was Joe's plan once Rigdon was excommunicated? Rigdon would need to be dealt with, or he may constitute an even more dangerous opponent than Reckitt Bennett had been for over a year by this point, right? Rigdon also had the position of postmaster of Nauvoo, so he was in a position to orchestrate the most effective disinformation campaign against Joe and the church should he decide that he was ready to go public with an exposition of the criminal empire of Nauvoo. However, Rigdon also spent most of his time confined to his home, suffering from illness that can only be speculated on by historians today. You know, Rigdon had suffered head trauma at an early age, which could have altered his brain in such a way that, mental illness described as melancholia at the time was the result. It's unclear exactly what afflicted Rigdon, but he wasn't well. Regardless of his mental state, he controlled a fair amount of the information going in and out of Nauvoo. He handled every private correspondence among everybody in town unless they were sent through direct messenger. That's a powerful tool if Rigdon turned an enemy against the church, especially considering everything he knew from the foundation of the religion. So what solution did Joe have once Rigdon was out, once he was excommunicated? Well, I'd be willing to bet that if Rigdon did go dissenter while in the confines of Nauvoo, he may just be taken with a mysterious illness and simply be found dead in his home, where he spent most of his time anyway. Now, that would probably be the end of the issue, never requiring further explanation than he, wasn't well and he spent most of his time in his house with illness for years, right? Everybody would have seen it coming if the dude just up and died. It may garner some attention or some inquiry about the Danites, but that would only be rumors and that would blow over eventually. So the plan, if Rigdon did defect and begin smearing the name of the prophet, well, you make him go away. No further plan needed. But it was always better for everybody to keep Rigdon close. That way, Joe could keep an eye on this frenemy who also had the most dirt on the prophet, more so than any other living human being. What about Rigdon's headspace during this trial? Well, to shed some speculative light on what must have been going through Rigdon's head during the month from when he was officially disfellowshipped until he was reinstated as a result of this hearing a month later, let's turn our gaze back to the journal of Wilford Woodruff in mid-August 1843. Quote, Elias Higby, Joseph Smith preached funeral sermon 13th August 1843 at Nauvoo. End quote. This is a simple passage, but also insightful if we consider surrounding events. Joe's own journal recounts the funeral sermon in quite a bit greater detail in the hand of Joe's personal scribe, William Clayton. As was typical with any sermon that Joe preached, he used the inciting incident of a prominent church leader dying as a jump-off point to needlessly expound on his ever-changing Mormon theology. Now, I've cut most of that out, but here's just a few relevant extracts from this funeral sermon. Quote, Sunday, August 13th, 1843, Joseph preached in relation to the death of Judge Elias Higby. 2 Peter, 3rd chapter, 10 through 11 verses. Text said he was not like other men. His mind was continually occupied with the business of the day, and he had to depend entirely upon the living God for everything he said on such occasions. We are called thus to mourn this morning the death of a good man, a great man, and a mighty man. It is a solemn idea that man has no hope of seeing a friend after he has lost him. Where has Judge Higby gone? Who is there that would not give all his goods to feed the poor and pour out his gold and silver to the four winds to come where Judge Higby has gone? That which hath been hid from before the foundations of the world is revealed to babes and sucklings in the last day. The world is reserved unto burning in the last days. End quote. Now we get to the crux of his sermon that discusses the position of Judge Elias Higby. Now, it discusses the doctrine of election sealing, which is the second anointing, induction into the quorum of the anointed in Nauvoo, the highest possible ranks of Nauvoo elitism. That ensures a person's salvation and exaltation, and a similar version of this ceremony is performed in temples today. It's known as the second anointing. It also mentions the covenant of Abraham. And when it says covenant of Abraham, given the historical context of when this funeral sermon is given, that's talking about polygamy. Here we go. Quote, "For destroying angels, holding power over the four quarters of the earth until the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads. What is a seal? Shall I tell you? No. Doctrine of election and sealing of the servants of God on the tops of their heads, 'tis not the cross as the Catholics would have it. Doctrine of election to Abraham was in relation to the Lord. A man wishes to be embraced in the covenant of Abraham. A man like Judge Higby in World of Spirits is sealed unto the throne, and doctrine of election is sealing the father and children together." And then that rest of the sermon there is cut off. The rest of the page is blank. "To the mourner, do as the husband and father would instruct you. Then you shall be reunited. I have been acquainted with Judge Higby for a long time. I never knew a more tender-hearted man." End quote. Yeah, Joe did know Judge Elias Higby for a long time. This guy was 10 years Joe's senior. He was born in October of 1795. This guy joined the Mormons in 1832 and was one of the early settlers in Jackson County, Missouri. This guy was ordained an elder of the church by his dad, Isaac Higby, in 1833. He was one of the contingent of Mormons driven from Jackson County in 1833 to 1834 and then settled in Clay County. So Elias Higby, he'd also helped build the Kirtland Temple. He had invested in the Kirtland Safety Society. He was a Danite and part of the battle at Crooked River when the Mormons aggressively attacked the Missouri State Militia. But he made it out alive, like almost everybody else. I mean, this guy was an organizing member of the committees that coordinated the Mormon exodus from Missouri to Illinois and helped Joe and Rigdon buy up land from Horace Hotchkiss and Isaac Galland that the Mormons settled on in Illinois and Iowa. This guy was partially responsible for acquiring the land on which Nauvoo was built. Elias Higby also traveled with Joseph Smith to Washington, D.C. to petition President Van Buren and Congress for redress for the Mormons being driven from Missouri. Elias Higby was also a member of the Temple Building Committee, a member of the Nauvoo Legion, and also inducted into the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge. So when Joe says that he's been acquainted with Judge Higby for a long time, yeah, that's a bit of an understatement. This was one of the earliest OG Mormons from the early Kirtland era. Judge Higby also had two sons, named Chauncey L. Higby and Francis M. Higby, who would later become two of Joe's greatest enemies, a mere 6 months after their father's death. Francis and Chauncey Higby were two of the 7 publishers of the Nauvoo Expositor. The Nauvoo Expositor was published June 7th, 1844. Joe declared the Nauvoo Expositor a public nuisance and had it burned to the ground, which got him and Hiram sidekick Abiff Smith thrown in Carthage jail, where they met their untimely demise 20 days after the paper was published. So, the last name of Higbee definitely carries some weight throughout the history of Mormonism. And of course, Hiram sidekick Abiff Smith was chosen to replace Elias Higbee on the Temple Building Committee. So my overall point is, Elias Higbee and his sons had been member of the church for over a decade by the time Elias Higbee died and his sons turned against the prophet and published the expose that killed the prophet. All of the Higbees were vehemently opposed to polygamy. The revelation on polygamy was given, and Elias Higbee dies of cholera, and Joe gave a cryptic funeral sermon that directly references polygamy and invokes the term of the destroying angels. Elias Higbee wasn't the only high-ranking member of the church to just suddenly and unexpectedly die at this tumultuous time in Nauvoo history. Another prominent member, James Adams, was a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Black Hawk War. He'd been a member of the church since 1840. He was elected as a probate judge of Hancock County on August 7th, 1843, and similarly died suddenly and unexpectedly only 4 days later. Joe's funeral sermon for James Adams is similarly cryptic to that of Elias Higbee. Quote, "All men know that they must die, and it is important that we should understand the reasons and causes of our exposure to the vicissitudes of life and of death, and the designs and purposes of God in our coming into the world, our sufferings here, and our departures hence. I saw James Adams first at Springfield when on my way from Missouri to Washington. He sought me out when a stranger took me to his home, encouraged and cheered me, and gave me money. He has been a most intimate friend. I anointed him to the patriarchal power to receive the keys of knowledge and power by revelation to himself. He has had revelations concerning his departure, and he has gone to a more important work. When men are prepared, they are better off to go hence. Brother Adams has gone to open up a more effectual door for the dead. The spirits of the just are exalted to a greater and more glorious work. Hence they are blessed in their departure to the world of spirits. Enveloped in a flaming fire, they are not far from us, and know and understand our thoughts, feelings, and motions, and are often pained therewith. Flesh and blood cannot go there, but flesh and bones, quickened by the Spirit of God, can. If we would be sober and watch in fasting and prayer, God would turn away sickness from our midst. Hasten the work in the temple. Renew your exertions to forward all the work of the last days, and walk before the Lord in soberness and righteousness. Let the elders and saints do away with light-mindedness and be sober." End quote. There's quite a few mysterious deaths in Nauvoo Mormon leadership upon the dissemination of the polygamy revelation. That's important to note, right? When Joe gave his 1831 revelation that the Mormons would consecrate the property of the Gentiles in Missouri and bring it to the bishop's storehouse to fund their communalistic religion, it happened. That revelation was understood to be the word of God, and the Mormons stole a ton of property in Missouri, which eventually led to the extermination order and their exodus to Illinois. The prophet of God spoke that you should consecrate the property of the Gentiles, and the people took it as the words of God and acted accordingly. So when the polygamy revelation says that all who learn of the new and everlasting covenant must accept it or be damned, that wasn't some idle legalism or biblical profundity. That was an operative point of the revelation. Prominent people died in Nauvoo at the end of 1843. Now, sure, cholera, many other illnesses killed indiscriminately. That was happening all the time, right? So that's my way of saying the most parsimonious interpretation of the historical record is that these people died from illness, right? But history doesn't always follow the rules of parsimony when speculation outside of the provided evidence can provide likely explanations as well. So with this aspect of the Nauvoo criminal empire revealed, maybe that adds a little more context to the excommunication hearing for Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon's biographer, Richard Van Wagner, found a newspaper clip talking about this hearing in which it said that, quote, Sidney Rigdon was brought up by the prophet and abused without measure, that he cried for mercy like a whipped puppy. End quote. I think interpreting this as Rigdon crying for mercy about his membership in the church, I think that's a bit simplistic and too generous to the powers that put him in the hot seat in the first place. I believe Rigdon was delivering one of the most crucial orations of his life, because his life was in the balance. If Sidney Rigdon were excommunicated, he would be the most powerful enemy of the prophet. Enemies of the prophet get visits from the Danites. Joe had spent this entire hearing and the month of Rigdon's disfellowshipping prior to the hearing to paint Rigdon as an enemy of the church. He attempted to loop Rigdon and Bennett in a conspiracy together to take down the prophet and the church, and we know that Bennett was treated as the ultimate enemy of the church. Joe sent his destroying angel, Pistolback and Porter, to follow Bennett around Illinois and intimidate him into silence. It didn't work, but even before Bennett left Nauvoo, Joe was trying to intimidate him, according to his own count anyway, which, it may have some issues. But here's a conversation between Joe and Reckitt Bennett after Bennett had resigned from the office of mayor and had been excommunicated from the church. Quote, "We entered the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, and he locked the door, put the key in his pocket, drew a pistol on me, and said, 'The peace of my family requires that you should sign an affidavit and make a statement before the next city council exonerating me from all participation whatever, either directly or indirectly, in word or deed in the spiritual wife doctrine. And if you do not do it with the apparent cheerfulness, I will make catfish bait out of you, or deliver you over to the Danites for execution tonight. For my dignity and purity must and shall be maintained before the public, even at the expense of life. Will you do it or die?' I replied that he had better procure some other person or persons to do so, as there were a plenty who could do it in truth. 'No,' said he, 'that will not do, for it is known that you are well acquainted with all my private acts, better than any other man, and it is in your power to save or damn me. And as you have now withdrawn from the church in an honorable manner, over my own signature, a privilege never granted to any other person, you must and shall place it out of your power to injure me or the church. Do it, or the Mississippi is your portion. Will you do it?' I remarked that it was a hard case, that I would leave peaceably and without any public exposition if he would excuse me. He replied, 'I tell you, as I was once told, your die is cast, your fate is fixed, your doom is sealed if you refuse. Will you do it or die?' I remarked that I would under the circumstances, but that it was hard to take advantage of an unarmed man. 'If you tell that publicly,' said he, 'death is your portion. Remember the Danites.'" End quote. According to Bennett, Joe threatened him and forced him to sign an affidavit at the point of a gun. Then, when Reckitt Bennett was able to leave the city, get out of that locked room with the prophet, and began publishing his expose letters, Pistolback and Porter came knocking on his door. Joe tried to have Bennett assassinated. Anybody attached to Bennett was equally as evil in the minds of the church leaders. So if Joe could successfully brand Hingepin Rigdon to be in league with Bennett, well, Rigdon just might become catfish bait as well. Does that shed any light on why this excommunication hearing was so damn important to Joe, Rigdon, and the church as a whole? In this hearing, Rigdon was quite literally arguing for his life. Not against the Missourians or against dissenters in the church, as had been the case before, but against the prophet himself. The criminal empire of Nauvoo was vast and dark. Nobody's life was safe if they could be perceived as a threat to the prophet and his kingdom on the Mississippi. After the vote was tallied and Rigdon was allowed to remain in his position, not only in the church, but as a counselor to the first presidency, his and Joe's relationship set on a path of repair. This repair was absolutely crucial because Rigdon was fairly well known outside of the church and was the most reasonable political ally for Joe in his upcoming presidential run, for reasons that we'll discuss in coming episodes. So in a polarized shift from his previous approach to handling Rigdon, Joe quickly became very friendly to Rigdon, even if they had skeletons in their friendship closet from doctrinal arguments, polygamy, execution of leading the church, or anything else that caused their relationship to chafe, right? So once again, from Richard Van Wagner's biography of Rigdon, quote, Ebenezer Robinson, longtime church printer, presented a much more benevolent view of the prophet's 1844 assessment of his sporadic esteem for Rigdon. Called to accompany Rigdon to Pittsburgh in June 1844, Robinson was admonished by Smith to, quote, stand by Elder Rigdon under all circumstances, and uphold his hands on all occasions, and never forsake him. For he is a good man, and I love him better than I ever loved him in all my life. For my heart is entwined around his with cords that can never be broken. End quote. A lot happens in Nauvoo from August of 1843, when Rigdon was disfellowshipped, to June of 1844, when Rigdon is headed to Pittsburgh to electioneer for Joe as his vice presidential candidate. Rigdon's life was in danger at this time, during this disfellowshipping / excommunication hearing, but he clawed his way back into favor with the prophet. That means Rigdon narrowly escaped a visit from the destructives, the daughters of Zion, the Danites. Others, however, they underestimated the power of the prophet, and they weren't so lucky. That's going to do it for our episode for today. If you guys are not listening to Scathing Atheist, first off, why not? Second off, they're reading through the Book of Abraham, and it is absolutely hilarious. Well, I mean, they're reading through the entire Pearl of Great Price, but they just got to the Book of Abraham. So episode 326 of Scathing Atheist, I would highly recommend you tune into it because, well, the Puzzle and a Thunderstorm crew, they are truly masters of atheist and skeptic comedy and political commentary. And, you know, they put a lot of time and effort and work into their show to make it sound so effortless and hilarious. So if you are not listening to Scathing Atheist, rectify that oversight and start with episode 326. They get into the Book of Abraham segment around minute about 28 or so, sometime after that. That's when you get to, if you're just listening for the Book of Abraham, check it out. It's truly some of the hardest I have ever laughed before. Just to hear lay people taking on, never Mormons taking on the Book of Abraham. It's just too much fun. So, of course, that's the only announcement for today. We also had an email, and I wanted to read this. This is from Shane, based on the previous episode. This is what Shane said. I enjoyed your recent podcast about Alexander Neubauer. And I say that differently because I said Neubauer the entire episode because, well, let me just continue reading Shane's email. You're wrong about nobody in your audience having prior knowledge about him. Lance Owen's article has been around a while. Now that is something I don't think I spoke to at all, but I did mention that it's an article from 1994. Yeah, I mean, it's been around for a long time. It just so happens that it's one that I haven't heard referenced and I haven't seen any other expansions on it before. So it was a remarkable article when I found it and when I was referenced or when somebody told me about it. And since then I've referenced it a few times because it is quite a remarkable article. However, this kind of reveals the divide in the listening audience, right? So I have a feeling like maybe 2 or 3 of you listeners actually have, made more than just a hobby out of studying Mormon history, where you've actually dug into a lot of the sources that I read from and, actually know more Mormon history than I ever will know. I'm sure there are quite, at least a few of you out there. But for the other 9 listeners, I'm kind of struck with this weird position of like, how do I, communicate deep Mormon history to people who don't know much about it, or to, make it still interesting for people who know way more about it than I do, and to keep it interesting and entertaining in that way. Sometimes I have to paint with a bit of a broad brush. So that's kind of why I said, I doubt any of you have ever heard of Alexander Neubauer. And of course I was mispronouncing it. So Shane continues, You might find it interesting that Hugh Nibley is descended from Neubauer, which is something I didn't know, and then also concluded with saying, in German, the diphthong EI, an E followed by an I, is pronounced like an English long I, as in island. So the entire episode, I was pronouncing Alexander Neubauer's last name incorrectly. I did not know that Hugh Nibley was descended from Neubauer. Maybe that's something I had read or picked up earlier at some point, but it had completely escaped my memory in prepping for the episode. But that is really quite interesting. So that's all of Shane's email. Very simple detail and correction for pronunciation, as well as for showing that there are some listeners out there who know deeper Mormon history than I do. And I hope that there are some of you that this is still entertaining for if you do know the deeper Mormon history. And Lance Owen's article, it's amazing. Joseph Smith and the Kabbalah. It really is an incredible article. And yes, it has been around for over 20 years now. So all of that said, of course, we do have some new patrons to thank. Now, patrons are the people who support the show over at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. We have new pledges by Lynette, a pledge edit by Kevin, a pledge by Nicholas, a new pledge by Anne, and a new pledge by Jean or Jeannie. I'm not sure. So all of the new pledges, as well as the pledge edit, thank you all so much for pledging to support the show, for giving me your hard-earned money, and perpetuating the research and time that goes into producing this podcast. Of course, patrons of the show over at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism, you get the extended edition of the episode every week. That's also the variety segment where I kind of, diverge around, jump around some different topics. It's also uncensored. So if you like the older episodes where I was a little looser with my language, maybe consider supporting the show over at patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. You also get extra episodes every week. We are now just 2 chapters away from finishing the John Bennett expose of 1842 history of the saints with my commentary. So we just have another about 15 pages to read on that, one more episode. And then you get that's the entire book completely done with commentary. And you can find that if you go to the Patreon page and you search NAMO Book Club or History of the Saints or John C. Bennett or Reckitt Bennett, you'll find all of those episodes under those tags. So thank you, of course, to all of those who do pledge to support the show. And also, if you don't pledge to support, it's really helpful if you go to your podcasting app of choice, whether iTunes, whether Stitcher, whatever the case may be, and, leave a 5-star review. It really helps with visibility, helps people to see when they search for Mormon. The ones with the higher ratings typically get the downloads and get the new ears on them. So that really helps out a lot with the show. But if you're unable to do all of those things, word of mouth is great. If you want to contact me, you can do so nakedmormonism@gmail.com, just like Shane did. And, I may read your message out on the show if it's a correction or if it's something that needs to be addressed. And also, I'm on, Facebook, Twitter, all of the usual places at Naked Mormonism. You can find me or get in touch with Julie, or, if you mention me, it usually draws me from my little introvert lair here in Ground Gnome Studios. But of course, if you're not interested in doing any of those things or unable to do so, you still hit the download button. You're still listening to the podcast. And for that, I thank you so much for lending me your ear and, helping perpetuate the marvelous work in a podcast. What kind of a dick would I have to be to say that in earnest? Marvelous work in a podcast. I hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast as legal counsel. Music is written and performed by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2019, all rights reserved.